I did leave The Guardian because I was told I was not able to write about certain things the way that I felt was the honest way to write about them, whether it's about gender or anti-Semitism.
This is The Storytellers, where each week we speak to long-standing journalists at The Times and The Sunday Times and go through 3 of their career-defining stories. And it's a huge pleasure this week to be joined by Hadley Freeman, the columnist and features writer. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for being with us. We're going to dive straight into your stories, Hadley. And the first one you've picked out is The Story That Made You. It's an interview with the actor Michael J. Fox in 2013. He talked openly about his Parkinson's diagnosis at the age of 30 with you. And you've interviewed so many big names in your career. Ben Affleck was delightful, you said. Justin Timberlake was a drag. Keanu was so handsome you couldn't speak. Why this interview? Why Michael J. Fox?
Well, it feels a bit embarrassing to pick this one. I don't know if it made me, but I would say how much it really changed my approach to writing. Because I did do it 13 years after I first became a professional journalist in 2000. But before then, when I was doing interviews, I didn't really have much faith in my judgment necessarily about someone. And I wasn't really sure what the point of an interview was other than to get good quotes. And The Guardian, where I was at the time, sent me to New York to interview Michael J. Fox because he had his sitcom that was just starting. And I am such a huge Michael J. Fox fan from childhood. And it was the first time I'd interviewed someone who I was really starstruck by when they walked in the room. I couldn't believe I was in the same room as Marty McFly. And he was so delightful, and I felt so happy interviewing him. And then when I came out, I thought, actually, I want to convey to readers how exciting it was to be with him in a way that's hopefully not like press release and, just kind of like PR, but just someone, to explain why this person is so great and why this person has affected so many people's lives. And that's what I tried to do. And readers responded really well. And then I began to have a bit more faith in how I wrote about people. I thought, actually, I can do my take, my perspective, try to make the reader feel in the room with me.
So it's giving the personal side to a story, which many feature writers do brilliantly without making the story about you, obviously.
Yes, I personally don't like it when interviews are about the person. I've had to do that or the interviewer, I've had to do that. I had to do it with Keanu because I was so overwhelmed by him, again, so starstruck that I could barely speak. So when I looked at the quotes, looked at the transcript afterwards, I just thought, this reads like a brain dead person did this interview. So I thought, I'm going to have to make this about how overwhelmed I was, how I was a 12-year-old girl again with posters of Bill and Ted all over my bedroom, and try to explain what it's like to have been that girl and then interviewing him as an adult, which is what it was. But mostly I just try to say, this is what it's like to be with this person in the room. That's what I try to do with interviews.
When you met Michael J. Fox before the interview, you said that he gave you a certain look, and that when he meets people for the first time, he gives you a look. And so just take us back to that moment. What was that look?
So I met him in his office on the Upper East Side in New York, and his Parkinson's was bad then. It's since gotten a lot worse, but it was quite bad. And he still has that very boyish face that he had in 1984 when he was making Back to the Future. So he is used to people recognizing him, and he's used to people then looking kind of devastated when they see him, because he already had all the symptoms of Parkinson's at that point, the kind of the jerking and the difficulty walking. And it's very jarring to see, Marty McFly, as we all remember him, being that way. So he has this slightly defensive look about him. And then we went into his office, and he could see I was just totally overwhelmed to meet him. And then we also connected because I grew up down the road from where he lives with his wife and children, and I went to the same school as his kids. And so then he felt that connection. And also he could just, I hope, see that I love talking to him. And I've since interviewed him again several times. And it's just always a really wonderful experience talking to him.
At the end of that interview, you said you did something that you've never asked an interviewee for before, and that's asked to have a photo.
I did. It was the first time I ever did that. I took a selfie with him, and I still treasure it. It's still in my favorite photo file on my phone. Yeah, I couldn't leave without having that.
Have you asked anyone for a photo since?
I have actually. So I obviously did with Keanu. And that one was just funny because I was 9 months pregnant at the time. And so wearing a disgusting maternity dress. And he was so sweet. And he still looks exactly the same. And there I was looking like a blobby mushroom. Like it is just a funny photo. And the other one I asked was Rob Reiner, who is another great hero of mine, who's a director, and he did Spinal Tap and Princess Bride and Misery and A Few Good Men. So I love him too.
Let's move on to another interview you did, but a very different one. This is in 2019, and it's with another actor, Tony Slattery. And this was meaningful to you because when you'd come to London from the US at the age of 11 or 12, you basically discovered Tony Slattery yes. when you were on your pursuit to sort of get to know British celebrities.
Yes, so we moved here in 1990, and I really wanted to understand British pop culture because as a 12-year-old, you know, that is how kids bond with each other. And Tony Slattery was just everywhere at that moment. It was, and I loved Whose Line Is It Anyway? I used to stay up late on Friday nights and watch it, and I loved him. And I saw that he was doing something. I can't remember even what year this was. Was it 2019?
2019, yeah.
I saw that he was doing something at the Edinburgh Festival, and so I asked The Guardian, where I still was then, if I could interview him. And he came to the Guardian office, which was so sweet. And you know, he hadn't been on the public scene in about 25 years at that point. And he turned up, and he looked so unwell. And so we went into a little office to talk, and it was incredibly difficult in a lot of ways because it was so sad what had happened to him in his life. And the thing that was really overwhelming in that interview is he told me, and he hadn't told really anyone else at that point, because I said to him, you know, he'd had all this trouble with drugs and bipolar and anger issues and drinking. And he kept saying he was so angry, but he'd had this wonderful life. He just said it's just this anger. And I said to him, you know, I don't understand. What do you mean you're angry? What are you angry about? Because you keep saying how everything was great. And he just suddenly said it had something to do with a priest when I was 8 years old. And he hadn't said that to anyone before. And I'd never had anyone say it to me, you know, in life, let alone an interview, confess that they'd suffered childhood sexual abuse. And I called him a bunch of times after the interview saying, you know, are you sure you want me to put this in? You know, I don't want to be exploitative here. And he was like, no, do it. And writing it, that was another time when I thought I really want people to understand what it felt like to be in the room with him. This really sweet, lovely man who had everything in front of him, who is now forced to be living gyro check to gyro check. You know, he and his partner, didn't have any food in the cupboard that week. So his boyfriend was working on the tube that week as a ticket collector, like trying to make some money for food. Like it's so devastating. And the reaction was amazing. Like suddenly everybody was, when it came out, readers were tweeting and emailing me like their favorite Tony Slattery clips. And it was this huge outpouring of love for Tony Slattery, which was wonderful. And on the back of that, Panorama then did a show with him in which he went back to try to sort of understand the damage this abuse had done to his life. And I interviewed him again for that. And we have stayed in touch. But it was very difficult doing that. There are a lot of ethical issues with that kind of interview, but also a really special thing to try to bring someone who's been forgotten back to the public eye, but in a loving way, hopefully.
Yeah, and trying to do that sensitively whilst yourself faced with a person who is, you know, trying to be joyful but still broken in many other ways and has been through such a hard time, but still you want to celebrate the brilliant genius he is. That's a really difficult thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've had other things. I think the other interview which was really special to me was Mel Brooks, who I interviewed during lockdown. I'd interviewed him once before, and when I interviewed him during lockdown, it was just very sad. His best friend Carl Reiner had died, who I interviewed him with before, and it was just on the phone because Mel Brooks is in his 90s. He doesn't know how to use Zoom and stuff. And there were times where he's crying, and he really is still grieving for his wife who died about 15 years ago now. And you do think, am I exploiting someone's pain for like easy clicks? How am I doing this? But then, and I would be really cautious for a lot of people. But with someone like Mel Brooks and with Tony Slattery, they want to tell the world how they're feeling. Tony wants to say, I wanted to do better. And Mel wants to say, I just miss Carl and my wife so much, Anne. And that's quite special to hopefully help them bring that message to people.
Back to that moment in the interview where he reveals that his anger comes from trauma related to a priest. You say, I can feel both of us starting to recoil from the subject, him because he doesn't want to think about it anymore, and me because I'm terrified of pulling on a thread that will cause him to unravel entirely. And that's a tough call to make as a journalist, isn't it? Because you get to the point where you could potentially pull on the thread and reveal extensive abuse that we know he was okay talking about later on. Or you get to the point where you think, actually, this isn't going to help the interview to touch on this right now. Was that a hard call to make kind of afterwards when you thought about that decision? Do you go further into that or not?
No, I think, because part of my problem with doing interviews before was I was really scared of insulting people. So I didn't like asking questions. And then I realized you need to have some information in order to write a good interview. But with Tony Slattery, I had talked to him at that point for about 45 minutes, and he's such a people pleaser. And I could recognize that right away. Like, he was really trying to give me what I wanted. And then at that point, when he said that about the priest, and then I said something like, maybe, something really pat, like maybe you have dealt with it, because he said he never bothered dealing with it. I said, maybe you have dealt with it if you're able to talk to me about it. And he said, yes, indeedy, in this really kind of equally pat way. And I realized at that point he was shutting down and couldn't think about it anymore. And I just thought, what am I doing? Like, he said what needed to be said. And actually on the TV show, when someone did press him about it, he got really angry and suddenly blew up and, did talk about the abuse in a very graphic way, but in a really angry, devastated way. And his partner, Mark, who's with him, just looked completely stricken. And you just felt at that point, this does not need to be in the public domain. Like, we do not need to know exactly what happened to him. All we need to know is that something traumatic happened to him as a child. And that explains why he is this kind of wreck as an adult. Like, that's all that needs to be told. I don't need to get into voyeuristic stuff here. You
say that you used to be afraid of offending people. That is something that I never imagined you to say. And look, obviously, you've been doing this gig for years, right? And so, of course, it is learned over a period of time. But for you to say that, kind of was still a factor, maybe still a decade ago? Maybe still
massively.
Okay.
Massively.
So how did you get over that? How did you just grow up? Did you have to toughen up? Did you take the risk and it worked and you kept taking risks?
With interviews, what happened was I would come back and having not pressed somebody enough. And my editor would say, well, did you ask them why? Or did you? And I would be like, no. And then I realized, I am still very much a people-pleasing schoolgirl inside of me. And I realized being told off by the teacher is worse than insulting someone in an interview. So I was still trying to please my editors. So there's a part of me that's trying to please my editors and get good quotes, so prodding people. But in terms of not offending people, you mean like in columns, that is something that has happened much later, I would say. In my mid to late 30s, I've suddenly stopped worrying so much and to be more confident in what I think and to just say it.
I want to touch on the fragile people who you've spoken to. We've just discussed Tony Slattery, but also Michael J. Fox, vulnerable in his own way. You've written about your own experiences of anorexia and drug taking, and I wonder whether your past and what is within you, the fragility within you, as there is fragility within all of us, whether that informs your writing, whether that allows you to tap into something that you can convey to the interviewee or on the paper afterwards.
I've never really thought about it in terms of comparing it to me. I guess there is a part of me that thinks those sorts of stories can be quite revealing in a broader sense about someone rather than just being an easy headline. And those self-destructive impulses aren't just a failure of somebody. Like, I've interviewed Pete Doherty a couple times and other people who've had trouble with drugs, Corey Feldman and stuff. And I don't see it as just a kind of easy rock and roll thing or whatever. I can see that there's often a bigger picture that's quite interesting to try to get to and try to find the human story behind it. But I am also aware of, the potential to exploit somebody, and I am wary of that. So Corey Feldman was this 80s teen actor who had
heartthrob as well.
Indeed, who had a sort of terrible time afterwards, and his best friend Corey Haim died not very long ago, and they were just kind of classic child actor casualties. And when I went off to interview him a few years ago and then wrote the piece up, and he really wanted to present himself as successful and strong and doing great now. And I just sort of described what I saw, which was him living this quite weird life in LA in a house full of his old memorabilia, still obsessed with Michael Jackson, I think it was, who was a friend of his. And anyway, it was all a bit weird. And I described it as quite weird. And Corey Feldman was not happy about it and, took to social media about it. And I did feel bad. I didn't feel like I endangered him. I felt I had a, kind of, I don't want to sound like I'm Woodward and Bernstein here, but, I have a duty to tell the truth. But you do have to be careful with that, because some people don't want that truth to be revealed, if that makes sense. And you have to kind of be canny about does this person understand what is happening here with this interview? Basically.
Yeah. And do you think that your past experiences add an element to your writing when you're speaking to other, fragile people? Look, everyone's fragile. I don't want to label people. I don't want to call you fragile either, because it sounds wrong. But, clearly you've written, about your experiences with illness, and whether that adds a sensitivity to your writing that perhaps you wouldn't have, or someone without those experiences wouldn't have.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I honestly never thought about it that way at all. Maybe. I hope I'm sensitive in writing about it. But yeah, I also feel that it's not, maybe I am also aware that it's rarely a simplistic narrative. The way people write about those sorts of problems, whether it's drug addiction or eating, in an interview you have 2,000 words, and editors, not here obviously, but sometimes want to have like a very easy, happy ending, like everything's fine now. And I am very aware.
Or a snapshot headline is the other thing.
Yeah,
as well,
exactly. And everyone told me I was fat, but now I feel great about myself or whatever. But it's not like that. These things last for years. And I do think it's interesting. I do think how trauma or childhood things affects people is interesting. And I am always interested in how fame would affect somebody, because I think fame is an incredibly traumatizing and weird experience. And that's often underestimated. It's not like I'm saying, oh, poor celebrities, they suffer more than anybody else on the planet. But it is interesting how someone deals with it. And I can understand why someone would totally self-destruct if they became famous as a child or teenager, because God knows I would have.
Yeah. The story that stays with you is your first for the Sunday Times in December last year, 2022. You came to the paper after 22 years at The Guardian, pretty much your whole journalistic career there. And your first piece sets out your concern with a swing to gender rights as opposed to women's rights. And I noticed earlier you said that it's, more recently that you've been, confidently portraying your voice through your columns. And I'm sure this is an instance that relates to that as well. Just tell us about that. Tell us about writing this first piece and how important it was to get it on the page.
Well, so I chose this one as, I think it was the one that stayed with me, I guess, because it just felt incredibly liberating to be able to talk about some of these things in a way that journalists can't in other places. So I did really feel that feminism had been taking a real drubbing, basically, from the gender rights movement. This idea that a male person can identify as a woman because they feel like a woman. Well, no one has actually even said what that is. What does feel like a woman mean? And when you press down on it, it's always this incredibly retrograde idea of what a woman is, having long hair and dresses and high heels and manicures and stuff like that, to sort of briefly summarize what Eddie Izzard has said. That in itself I find incredibly insulting. And I also find it incredibly insulting to have men take things that are specifically designated for women, whether placed on sports teams or, less desirably a place in a woman's prison. And to say that women can't talk about their rights and women can't have things that are just for themselves, I find really, to be honest, a version of men's rights movement. And this is not attacking trans people, it's attacking the gender ideology movement, which has really been behind this. And I think a lot of women, particularly older women, have been very personally attacked about this, have lost their jobs. Cancelled is the term, but I find that a really vague term. Lost their jobs, not been invited for speaking opportunities, lost work in a way that men haven't. And that in itself is extremely telling to me. And it really does show that gender ideologues can't tell the difference between a man and a woman. Janice Turner and I get far more abuse on social media about this than Alex Massey, who also writes about this issue. And the men who write about it in The Spectator, they don't get abuse in the way that Janice or Julie Bindel or Suzanne Moore and I do. So it felt great to be at a paper that supported me in writing about this and to say, look, I'm not attacking a vulnerable minority here, but I am saying women need special spaces, and they need places that are women only, whether that's on a sports team or in a changing room or whatever. And the fact is, more than 2 women a week are still killed by men in England and Wales. And while trans people are vulnerable, it's not the same. They are not suffering the same kind of murder on that epidemic scale. And that is because male violence is a real problem. And that's why women need their own spaces.
Women need specific spaces. You left The Guardian because, can I say you were censored? Is that the right way to frame it without doing the snappy headline?
How would I put it? I did leave The Guardian because I was told I was not able to write about certain things the way that I felt was the honest way to write about them, whether it's about gender or anti-Semitism, which was very sad because I'd been there for 23 years. And up until about 6 years ago, I had incredible journalistic freedom, and I thought I would never leave that paper, and I loved it. And then suddenly things changed. And
why did they change, do you think?
People in charge change, stuff like that. And I think also it was also a wider movement. I mean, there was also a problem at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC's had a lot of trouble at liberal organizations. That there has been a fear of being on the quote unquote wrong side of history. And I would say that the gender ideology movement, particularly Stonewall, has done a great job of pretending that this idea that a man can identify as a woman just because he feels like it is the new gay rights movement. Whereas to me, it's the new men's rights movement, But there's a lot of people in liberal organizations who are terrified of, being homophobic. And, that's fair. That's a good impulse. You don't want to be bigoted. You don't want to be hurting a vulnerable minority. But also you could look at this more objectively and say, is this really a civil rights issue that males are on women's sports teams? Is this really, desegregating the South? Because I don't think it is.
Well, you talk about in the piece that we've mentioned how waves of feminism provoke a backlash. And you talk about the Me Too movement in 2017, Harvey Weinstein sexually assaulting many women, and how that movement, you call it the fourth wave of feminism, provokes a backlash, and that some of the gender ideology and the focus on gender rights over women's rights is part of the backlash.
It's a massive backlash. So many of the same people who were shouting, on Twitter, listen to women during Me Too, are now telling women to shut up when they say they need their own spaces, that they need their own changing rooms or bathrooms or whatever, that they don't want males going in there. I find it extraordinary. I really like the hypocrisy, and the 180 turn is really amazing. And then you see some of these same people now, arguing that because we haven't physically seen with our own eyes Israeli women being raped, therefore they weren't, let alone the fact that there is first-person testimony about that. There is a massive, massive backlash from, I would say, mainly left-wing men against the Me Too movement. And that's really sad. Lefty bros, socialist bros, there has always been a strong strain of sexism in there. And, that was around in the 80s, and it's come back again now. And to see so many men on the left, which is ostensibly the side that, champions women's rights and minority rights and all the rest of it, shouting at older women, shouting at women for daring to defend their spaces and defend their rights. Like, it's been a very illuminating experience for a lot of women. And for those men who try to, claim that's just the right wing that has concerns about the gender ideology movement, well, they're going to be in for a big surprise, I think.
Do you worry that where it's left us is with a pretty toxic debate playing out in the media that doesn't always represent what's actually happening on the ground, what's actually happening out there for people who are transgender or, people who are advocates for women's rights? Is it quieter actually on the ground than we might portray in the media? Is there a concern about whipping it up from both sides, but for your part on behalf of women's rights through the media?
Yes, although I would say that people campaigning for women's rights, by and large, by which I mean women like Julie Bindel, who's had a long history of advocacy, and Maya Forstater, Alison Bailey, they are not trying to silence anybody. They are just trying to speak, whereas it's really the gender ideology movement that tries to censor people. And in terms of does it reflect the reality, well, the truth is the reality is that Keir Starmer is coming back to the middle ground on this, having previously said it was wrong to say only women have a uterus. He does now seem to have a more sensible approach to this and a more realistic approach, presumably because he realized that gender ideology is a vote loser and that the vast majority of people in this country do not believe a male can be a woman just because they say they are. They can live as a woman by all means, but that doesn't mean they get to bend reality and force other people to make coercive speech and to pretend that this person is literally a woman. Like, live how you want, nobody cares. But there are still laws, and those laws exist to protect women.
Where do you think this will go? If we finish up on your journalism and what you'll keep writing about and your beliefs through your opinion pieces and your columns, where does that particular debate go, do you think, in the next decade?
I mean, I personally don't feel any need really to write about gender that much anymore because Keir Starmer has become sensible. I feel like Labour will probably be in power and they will be sensible about this issue. Therefore, I don't really need to write about it. If I was in America, it would be much trickier because the Democrat Party operates in opposition to the Republicans. And the Republicans are very homophobic, definitely, and therefore they have brought in the gender issue to it and they've sort of tied it together. And the Democrats are reactionary and they react against it, and therefore they are the most pro-gender rights as they can be, supporting the idea of males on women's sports teams and all that, which is it's anti-science. I really see the movement as anti-science and anti-women. But I think that whole thing is going to settle down now because in this country at least, and also in Europe, where, medical professionals are now coming, arguing that we cannot be giving puberty blockers to young kids. All of that is the scientific consensus is coming back to reality. So I don't feel the need to write about that so much anymore. The thing that I am writing a lot about is anti-Semitism, because I really do see a massive resurgence of that, and Jew hate, and using opposition to Israel's sort of war efforts as an excuse to engage in hatred of Jews.
If that's been bubbling under the surface for years, why the spike now? I mean, we've obviously got the conflict within the Middle East, but if we just sort of park that to one side for a moment, if that's possible, why has anti-Semitism been bubbling underneath the surface for so long, for a conflict in the Middle East to make it spike? Why do we all believe it had gone away, maybe rather ignorantly?
Yeah.
And I say that as a non-Jewish person, and why have we never invested enough thought into why it's not gone away?
Yeah, well, I agree. I find it fascinating. I just find anti-Semitism such a stupid ideology. I find it completely bewildering that people indulge in this nonsense. The idea that either Jews are so rich and controlling all the money in the world, or else Jews are kind of communists and working for Eastern Europe. It's always both things. Jews are ultra-capitalist and ultra-communist. For me, the Corbyn era was enormously eye-opening. I hadn't really thought about anti-Semitism.
Do you think that influenced?
In this country, definitely on the left, yes. Yeah. But I think people like to blame people for something. I think there's a lot of that, and they like to beat down on a group. And there's been so much kind of, with the rise of identity politics and much tiptoeing around different minority groups. Suddenly here's a minority group that you are really you're on the right side, just pummeling them and being, in America, we've seen videos of people being openly pro-Hamas. But the fact is there was a march in London a week ago, as I'm talking to UK, against anti-Semitism. Where was Labour? Where were any members of the Labour front bench? It was literally just a march against anti-Semitism. Who was marching in the front of that whole protest? Maureen Lipman? Really? Maureen, great, but really that's the most prominent person in this country that we can have.
And there were Conservative politicians there, weren't
yes, and for better or for worse. But anybody is surely against anti-Semitism. Why was it just, first of all, mainly Jews on that march, as usual? And why was none of Labour there? So, this is a problem that I think is growing. It's definitely a problem, particularly on the left, but also on the right.
Well, look, we look forward to reading those columns. Hadley Freeman, thanks so much for joining us on The Storytellers. Thank you.
Thanks.